Part 1. The Echo of a Miracle. The air in Mark's office was as sterile as the view of the Manhattan skyline was imposing. Every surface gleamed under recessed lighting glass, chrome, polished mahogany. It was an environment designed to project power and clarity. Two things Rachel Peterson prided herself on. She sat opposite her editor. The faint satisfaction of her latest exposé, a brutal takedown of a corrupt city councilman, still warming her. The councilman piece was a masterpiece. Rachel, vicious, meticulous. The lawyers are still sweating, Mark said, his praise a familiar currency between them. He slid a thin, manila folder across the vast desk. The gesture was casual, but the weight of it felt heavy. On the tab, in bold black letters, were two words: the Havenwood Miracle. Rachel's expression soured instantly. Her gaze flicked from the folder to Mark's face, searching for the joke. There was none. Havenwood. As in, Vermont, Mark? What is this, a fluff piece? It's a story with massive online traction, he said, leaning forward. Human interest, big heartland appeal. A man named Samuel Miller, small-town carpenter, diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. Given 3 months to live, he survived for nearly 5 more years. Died a couple of months ago. But the story is just now blowing up. People are calling it a miracle. Mark wanted a headline, something sensational and click-worthy that would dominate the weekend news cycle. Rachel recoiled, as if the folder were contaminated. You want me to cover some faith-healing nonsense, Mark? I dismantle corruption. I don't write bedtime stories for the gullible. It was probably a misdiagnosis. Then prove it, he challenged. That's the angle. Cynical New York journalist debunks small-town saint. Our readers will eat it up either way. A cold knot tightened in Rachel's stomach. It wasn't just the insult to her skills. It was the subject matter. Illness, loss, the quiet, arbitrary cruelty of it. It reminded her of the phone call a decade ago, the clipped, professional voice of a paramedic, and the yawning, meaningless silence that had followed her father's sudden death. There were no miracles then, only a gaping hole where a person used to be. She had built her career on a foundation of empirical evidence, of cold, hard facts, precisely because facts didn't leave you with empty platitudes. I have sources to cultivate on the waterfront union story, she argued, her voice tight. This is a waste of my time. Mark's friendly demeanor hardened. The union story can wait. Write this story. Rachel, make it good. Your next major project depends on it. The ultimatum hung in the refrigerated air between them. It was a power play, and they both knew it. With immense frustration, Rachel reached out and took the folder. Her fingers felt numb. Her goal was set. Simple and clean. Get to Havenwood. Find the logical explanation: a quack doctor, a medical error, a community lost in shared delusion. Write the debunking piece and get back to her real life, her real career. She would expose the truth, because the truth was all there was. The flight to Burlington and the subsequent drive south felt like a journey into another century. The relentless gray geometry of New York gave way to rolling hills ablaze in the fiery palette of a Vermont autumn. The air that greeted her when she stepped out of her rental car in Havenwood was so crisp and clean it almost hurt to breathe. The town was a postcard of quaint New England charm, a white steepled church, a town green, shops with hand-painted signs. Its slowness was a physical presence that grated on Rachel's city-honed nerves. She checked into a rustic inn where the floorboards creaked and the air smelled of cinnamon and old wood. Her first appointment was with Dr. Eris Thorne at the local clinic. The clinic, at least, was a familiar island of science in the sea of rustic charm. The space was modern, clean, and smelled of antiseptic. Dr. Thorne was a man in his 50s, professional and guarded, with eyes that assessed her with cool precision. Rachel opened her notebook, ready to find the hole in the narrative. Dr. Thorne, I'm here to report on the Samuel Miller case. I'd like to start with the diagnosis. Is there any possibility of an error in the initial assessment? Dr. Thorne's expression was unyielding. He swiveled in his chair and pulled up a file on his monitor. Miss Moise Peterson, the diagnosis was ironclad. Stage 4 pancreatic adenocarcinoma. The scans were unequivocal. The biopsy reports, which were confirmed by 2 separate labs, were definitive. He turned the screen toward her, pointing at dark, ominous shadows on a CT scan. Medically speaking, Mr. Miller should not have survived past that summer. He said it with no hint of wonder, only clinical puzzlement, but he lived for almost 5 years. Rachel pressed, "What's the explanation? Did you administer an experimental treatment?" Mr. Miller was offered palliative chemotherapy to manage his symptoms. He attended 2 sessions and then simply stopped coming. Dr. Thorne stated, his tone flat. He refused all further conventional treatment. So what? He just willed it away. The sarcasm in her voice was sharp. Dr. Thorne shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders. I am a man of science. I provide data, not explanations for anomalies. The town can have its miracle talk. I deal in what I can measure. He had given her the what Samuel Miller had inexplicably survived but offered no how. It wasn't the neat misdiagnosis she had hoped for. Against her will, the mystery deepened and her irritation grew. The realtor, a cheerful woman who seemed to know everyone in town, handed Rachel a single key. It's been cleared out for the sale, but you're welcome to look around. Poor Samuel. Such a quiet man. Samuel Miller's cottage sat at the edge of town, a small, unassuming structure with a tidy but empty yard. The air inside was thick with the lingering, spectral scent of sawdust and old wood, the ghost of a life spent shaping things by hand. The house was stark, almost monastic in its simplicity. The main room was empty save for the indentations in the carpet where furniture once stood. It was a lonely space, echoing with the absence of its owner. In the small, simple bedroom, the estate cleaners had been thorough. The bed was stripped to the mattress, the closet bare. It felt like a dead end, disappointed. Rachel ran a hand along a built-in dresser, its wood worn smooth from years of use. She pulled open the top drawers, empty. The middle drawers, empty. On a whim, she tugged at the bottom drawer. It stuck for a moment, then slid open with a soft groan. Inside, overlooked and left behind, lay a simple, leather-bound journal. It was worn at the edges, the cover softened with handling. Rachel lifted it out. It wasn't locked. She opened it to the first page. The date was written in a shaky but clear hand. It was from the week after his diagnosis. The first entry was not a prayer for salvation or a cry of fear. It was a quiet, potent distillation of rage. 3 months. All the time I wasted being angry. Now, there's only enough time left to be angry that there's no more time. Rachel read the words again. This wasn't the journal of a saint. It wasn't the testimony of a man touched by God. It was the voice of a real, bitter man staring into the abyss. A raw, unmiraculous fury. This, she thought, with a sudden, sharp thrill of discovery, was a mystery she could sink her teeth into. This was a truth she could uncover. Holding the journal, she felt the story shift under her feet. Her investigation had finally begun. Part 2. The Pilgrim's Path. That night, the silence of the Havenwood Inn was absolute, broken only by the whisper of pages turning. The only light in Rachel's room came from a single lamp. Its glow pooled on the worn leather of Samuel's journal. She devoured it, her journalistic instincts on high alert. She expected to find entries about miracle diets, secret prayers, divine visions, or perhaps a desperate search for a cure. Instead, she found a man dissecting his own soul. The early pages were a litany of lifelong resentments, cataloged with painstaking detail. There was a brother who had cheated him in a business deal decades ago, the sting of the betrayal still fresh. A friend who had borrowed a significant sum of money and never repaid it, the debt a symbol of a broken trust. He wrote of his own perceived failures as a father to a son who had grown distant. The gulf between them, an aching void. It was a catalogue of bitterness, a life defined by grudges held tight. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to shift. The furious, inward-looking entries gave way to something else. He started describing things outside of himself. The way the afternoon light hits the dust motes in the workshop. One entry read, "It looks like a galaxy." Another noted, "A finch has a nest in the eaves. Her song is the first thing I hear in the morning. I've never noticed that before." He wasn't writing about getting better. He was writing about paying attention. He was writing about letting go. The change was so subtle that Rachel almost missed it, a gradual turning from a clenched fist to an open hand. One entry, short and simple, snagged her professional curiosity, spent an hour at the community garden, didn't have the strength to pull weeds. Maria gave me a cup of mint tea. It felt like a blessing. Maria, that was her next lead. The Havenwood Community Garden was a vibrant, sprawling patch of life tucked behind the main street. It was filled with the hearty abundance of late-season vegetable squash, kale, pumpkins, and the defiant color of chrysanthemums and asters. Rachel found Maria Flores on her knees, her hands deep in the dark, rich earth, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was a woman in her 40s with a warm, grounded presence. "Maria Flores?" Rachel asked, feeling overly formal in her city clothes. Maria looked up and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's me? Can I help you? I'm a journalist. I'm writing a story about Samuel Miller." Rachel got straight to the point. "His journal mentioned you. I was wondering, was he using some kind of special herbal remedy from the garden, something to fight the cancer?" Maria's laugh was gentle, a soft, earthy sound. "Herbal remedy? No." She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Samuel didn't come here to take anything from the garden. Honey, he came here to give..." Rachel frowned, confused. "Give Dr. Thorne said he was very weak." "Oh, he was..." Maria confirmed, her expression softening with memory. "At first, he would just sit on the bench over there, just watching. Then one day, he brought out a little block of wood and a whittling knife. He started carving small, intricate wooden birds. He'd give them to the children who came to the garden with their parents. He never said much. He'd just smile and hand them a bird." Maria gestured toward a raised wooden planter filled with herbs. "He built that. Said some of our older members couldn't bend down so easily anymore. He couldn't do heavy lifting. So he did it piece by piece, over weeks. He would talk to people too, not about his illness, never about that. He'd ask about their kids, their jobs, their worries. He just listened." She looked around the vibrant space, as if seeing his presence everywhere. He made the garden more beautiful, not with his strength, but with his attention. We didn't see a dying man. We just saw Samuel. The testimony directly contradicted Rachel's working hypothesis of a man selfishly focused on his own survival. This wasn't the story of a man taking, but of a man giving away what little he had left. It was a quiet, selfless narrative that didn't fit her cynical frame. The journal frequently mentioned conversations with Father M, an anchor point in Samuel's shifting world. Following the thread, Rachel found herself pushing open the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Parish. The church was cool and quiet, smelling of old incense, beeswax, and polished wood, motes of dust. just like the ones Samuel had described, danced in the shafts of light slanting from the stained glass windows. She found Father Michael O'Connell near the altar, tending to a bank of votive candles, his movements slow and deliberate. He was in his late 60s, with a kind, weathered face and intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "You must be the journalist from New York," he said, his voice a soft Irish brogue. "Rachel Peterson. News travels fast in Havenwood." Rachel, a lifelong atheist, felt awkward and out of place. She kept her questions clinical. "Father, I'm trying to understand what happened with Samuel Miller. Did the church claim his survival as an official miracle?" Father Michael shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "The miracle, Ms. Peterson, wasn't that God cured Samuel's body. The miracle was that Samuel finally allowed God to heal his soul." He turned to face her fully. "Samuel came to me a few days after his diagnosis. He wasn't looking for a cure. He was suffocating. He'd spent 60 years building a prison of resentment, brick by painful brick. His anger at his brother, his disappointments, his pride, it was all he had. His diagnosis didn't give him a death sentence. It gave him a key to that prison. He chose to use it in the eyes of God. That is an act of profound faith." Troubled and intrigued by the priest's words, Rachel returned to her inn-room. The story was slipping through her fingers, refusing to be pinned down by facts and logic. It felt bigger, more complex. She opened the journal again, rereading the later entries, now illuminated by what the priest had said. Tucked into a leather flap at the back, her fingers brushed against a small, folded sheaf of papers. She hadn't noticed them before. She carefully unfolded them. They were letters, 3 of them, written in Samuel's shaky but determined hand. They were addressed, but had clearly never been sent. One was to his estranged brother, David. Another was to his distant son, Michael. The third was to the old friend who had never repaid his loan. Her breath caught in her throat as she read them. They were not pleas for reconciliation. They were not requests for an apology or an explanation. They were simple, unilateral statements of forgiveness. To his brother David, "I've carried the anger about the business for 30 years. It has been a heavy stone. Today, I am putting it down. I forgive you. I release the anger. I wish you peace. Samuel, to his son Michael, I know I was not the father you needed. I was quiet when I should have spoken, and angry when I should have been patient. For all my failings, I forgive myself. I hope you can find happiness. I love you. Dad, they were never sent." The realization struck Rachel with the force of a physical blow. Samuel didn't need a response. He didn't need his forgiveness to be accepted or acknowledged. The act of writing the words, of forming the intent in his own heart, was the destination. He wasn't trying to repair a relationship. He was trying to free himself. It was an act of internal, private healing, more powerful and profound than any public spectacle she could have imagined. The journal's final entries were less about words and more about a place. "The Chapel of the Fields," he called it, a place for quiet reflection on a hill overlooking the town. Following his sparse directions, Rachel found herself hiking up a narrow dirt path as dusk began to settle over the valley, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. The chapel was a small, simple structure of weathered gray stone, almost blending into the hillside. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was Spartan and silent. A simple wooden altar, a few rough-hewn pews, and a single, large window that framed the valley below. The silence was not empty. It was absolute, a presence in itself. It was a silence that demanded to be listened to. On the center of the altar, catching the last of the fading light, sat a single, exquisitely carved wooden bird, identical to the ones Maria had described. Rachel picked it up, its smooth, light wood feeling warm in her hand. In the overwhelming quiet of the chapel, with the small wooden bird as her only company, her professional armor finally cracked. The silence pushed inward, hushing the cynical reporter and forcing her to listen to the woman she had buried beneath it. And in that silence, a memory surfaced with an intensity that stole her breath. Her father, their last conversation, a stupid argument over something petty she couldn't even remember. His sudden heart attack the next day. The funeral, the silence that followed. She had never said she was sorry. She had never said goodbye. She realized her cynicism wasn't a philosophy. It was a shield built to protect her from the sharp, unresolved pain of that senseless loss. Holding Samuel's carved bird, standing in the silence he had sought, she felt a profound, unnerving connection to the journey of a dead man she had come to debunk, a journey of letting go of a bitterness she now recognized in herself. A single tear tracked down her cheek, hot in the cool air of the chapel. Part 3. The Nature of Healing. The next morning, Rachel walked back into Dr. Eris Thorne's office. The atmosphere was different because she was different. She was no longer a combative journalist looking for a flaw in his logic. She was a curious seeker, armed with a new, more profound question. Dr. Thorne looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. Ms. Peterson, I thought you'd be on your way back to New York by now. I have one more question. Doctor, she said, her tone quiet and serious. She didn't ask about miracles or anomalies. What is the medical effect on the human body of a complete and total release of lifelong stress and anger? What happens to our biology when the spirit finds peace? The question caught him off guard. He was a scientist, a man of charts and data, but he was also an honest one. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, his gaze distant for a moment. That's a fascinating question. He turned back to his monitor, pulling up Samuel Miller's charts again, though he seemed to be looking through them at something bigger. It's anecdotal, of course, he began, his voice hesitant, academic, but we are learning more and more about the psychoneuroimmunological axis, the link between the mind, the nervous system, and the immune system. We know that extreme chronic stress, the kind that comes from holding on to anger and resentment for years, floods the body with cortisol. Cortisol suppresses the immune system's ability to function effectively. It's inflammatory. It wears the body down. He paused, looking directly at Rachel. A radical reduction in that level of chronic stress, hypothetically, it could allow the body's natural defenses to function at a level we rarely get to observe. It could reduce inflammation, bolster T-cell activity. It wouldn't cure a stage 4 cancer. But could it slow its progression? Could it give the body a fighting chance it didn't have before? He let out a slow breath. I can't quantify peace, Ms. Peterson. It's not a variable I can enter into my equations, but I saw it in him. In his last year, he had this calm. He didn't fight the cancer, Dr. Thorne mused, almost to himself. He just stopped fighting everything else. The conversation was a revelation. It wasn't faith versus science. It was faith influencing science. It was a bridge, a plausible scientific framework that could hold the spiritual transformation she had witnessed. It was a language she could understand. That evening, the sky over Havenwood turned a bruised, sickly yellow. An unforecasted autumn storm rolled in from the mountains, and the wind began to howl. By nightfall, it was a full-blown gale. Rain lashed against the window panes of her in-room, and the power flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. The physical storm was a perfect mirror for the tempest raging inside her. She was cut off from the internet, from her editor, from her life in New York. She was trapped, alone with Samuel's journal, a single flickering emergency candle, and her own raw, unshielded emotions. The grief for her father, which had pricked her in the chapel, was now a palpable presence in the room, a roaring agony. She remembered their last conversation, the angry words she'd thrown at him over some forgotten teenage rebellion. He had died of a massive heart attack the next day, alone in his apartment. She never got to apologize. She never got to take it back. The guilt had been a quiet poison inside her for a decade, fueling her cynicism, hardening her heart. In the flickering candlelight, she read Samuel's unsent letters again. I forgive you. I release the anger. I forgive myself. This time, she saw her own story reflected in his shaky script. His need to forgive his brother was her need to forgive herself. The weight of her ambition, her carefully constructed persona, the years spent proving she was tough enough, smart enough, cynical enough, it all felt like an immense, unbearable burden, huddled in the dark, with the storm screaming outside. Rachel Peterson hit her lowest point, utterly lost and profoundly alone. She must have dozed off, slumped in the chair. She awoke to a profound stillness. The storm had passed. The air, washed clean by the rain, was cold and still. In the window, a faint, pearlescent light was beginning to silhouette the dark hills. It was the pre-dawn hour, a time of absolute quiet. Rachel sat up, her body stiff. The candle had burned down to a nub. She looked at the journal, lying open on the table, then at her own tired reflection in the dark glass of the window. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft, clear, golden light into the room, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, not with the sharp certainty of a journalist cracking a case, but with the quiet, intuitive clarity of a soul finding its truth. The miracle wasn't that Samuel Miller had survived for 5 years. The miracle was that he had truly lived them. He hadn't defied his diagnosis. He had transcended it. He didn't perform a miracle by cheating death, but by fundamentally changing how he chose to live in its shadow. By letting go of a lifetime of anger, by forgiving others without needing anything in return, by forgiving himself, and by focusing on small, silent acts of service, a carved bird, a raised garden bed he had healed his spirit. The extra years of life were not the prize. They were a consequence, a byproduct of that profound spiritual healing. The true miracle was the peace he found, not the time he was given. In that moment of crystalline understanding, Rachel knew exactly what she had to do. The path forward was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She reached for her phone, its battery mercifully still alive. She didn't look for her editor's number. Instead, her fingers scrolled through her contacts, past colleagues and sources, to a name she hadn't called in years. Her father's brother, her uncle, a man she hadn't spoken to since the stilted, grief-stricken conversations at the funeral. She pressed the call button, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and liberation. It rang once, twice, and then a sleepy, familiar voice answered. Hello. Part 4. A New Beginning. 2 days later, Rachel sat in a sun-drenched corner of a Havenwood cafe, the scent of coffee and baked bread in the air. Her laptop was open, the screen filled with words. Beside it sat an empty coffee cup and the small wooden bird from the chapel. She wrote, but the article that flowed from her fingertips was nothing like the sensational, cynical takedown her editor had demanded. She didn't use the word miracle in a supernatural sense. Instead, she wrote a moving, philosophical, and deeply personal account of Samuel Miller's final years. She framed the story not as a medical anomaly to be debunked, but as a powerful testament to the human spirit's capacity for healing through forgiveness and grace. She wove it all together, the clinical puzzlement of Dr. Thorne and his cautious words on psychoneuroimmunology, the gentle wisdom of Maria Flores in her garden, the profound philosophy of Father Michael O'Connell in his quiet church. Most powerfully, she used Samuel's own words from his journal, tracing his journey from a prison of bitterness to a state of quiet, active peace. She wrote about the unsent letters, presenting them not as a failed attempt at communication, but as a triumphant act of self-liberation. She knew, as she typed the final sentence, that this article could get her fired. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't sensationalist, it was sincere. It was an homage, not an exposé. But for the first time in her career, the potential consequences felt insignificant, with a sense of calm and acceptance that was utterly new to her. She attached the file to an email, addressed it to Mark, and hit send. In that simple click, she had chosen her own truth over her career. She had let go. 3 months later, Rachel stood in her small, bright apartment in New York City. The space looked different. The sterile, minimalist decor had been softened. There were plants on the windowsill, and the afternoon light seemed to linger, making the room feel warmer, more personal. On the wall hung a simple frame. Inside was a printed copy of her article, the headline, written by a surprisingly supportive editor after the story went viral. Read the Havenwood Way, How a Dying Man Taught a Town to Live. The piece had become an unexpected phenomenon. It didn't generate clicks through scandal, but through connection. It was shared by millions, lauded for its honesty and depth, and had won a prestigious award for feature writing. Mark, initially furious, had been swayed by the overwhelming public response and the flood of accolades. He had seen a different kind of power in her work, the power of sincerity. Rachel picked up a small watering can and tended to a pot of mint on her windowsill, a living souvenir she'd brought back from the Havenwood community garden. Its fresh scent filled the air. Her phone rang, and she smiled as she saw the caller ID. It was her uncle. Their conversation was warm and easy, filled with the comfortable chatter of a relationship being carefully, lovingly rebuilt. They made plans to have dinner the following week. After she hung up, she looked at the framed article on her wall. She realized Samuel Miller's story wasn't over. It hadn't ended with his last breath, or even with her article. His legacy continued, not just in the quiet town of Havenwood, but in the profound changes he had unknowingly inspired in a cynical journalist from the city. She had finally written her own unsent letters, not on paper, but through phone calls and honest conversations. In doing so, she had started her own new chapter. Her reflection looked back at her from the glass of the frame. The face was no longer hard, the eyes no longer guarded by a shield of cynicism. It was the face of a woman who had found a different kind of strength, a quiet, resilient peace. The miracle of Havenwood had found a new home,